Imagine a city of millions, a bustling, thriving metropolis, suddenly plunged into an almost supernatural darkness. This wasn't merely the absence of light, it was a physical weight, a cloying blanket that swallowed street lamps, smothered sound, and left you unable to see your own hand held mere inches from your face. For 5 terrifying days, time seemed to unravel. This wasn't a temporary blackout or a passing storm. It was the Great London Fog of 1952, a silent, creeping killer that brought the beating heart of the British Empire to a complete, suffocating standstill. How do you survive when the very air you breathe, the fundamental necessity of life, betrays you, becoming a toxic enemy that burns your throat and fills your lungs with poison? We are uncovering the harrowing stillness of that week, immersing ourselves in the chilling, almost dreamlike experience of a city slowly erasing itself from the map. How did millions of people navigate 5 days of suffocating darkness where visibility dropped to zero and the air itself transformed into a deadly, palpable presence that tasted of soot and sulfur? We're detailing not just the disaster, but the extraordinary adaptations, the quiet resilience, and the sheer will required to simply survive a horror that no one saw coming. Before we step into the mist and uncover the secrets hidden within the fog, I want to welcome you to our community. If you share our fascination with the shadows of history and the stories that shaped our world, please take a moment to subscribe and click the like button. It helps us keep the lantern lit in the dark corners of the past. And I want to hear from you. Right now, in this moment, go down to the comments and tell me, where in the world are you watching from and what time is it there? Are you watching this under the bright midday sun, or are you tucked in for the night, safe and warm? Let us know below. To truly understand the magnitude of the horror, we must first understand the deceptive normalcy that preceded it. The date is December 4th, 1952, a Thursday. London is a city in transition, caught between the traumas of the past and the hopes of the future. The deep, jagged scars of the Blitz are still visible in the gap-toothed rows of terraced houses and the bomb sites where willow herb grows through the rubble. But there is a renewed energy vibrating in the streets. Winston Churchill is back in Downing Street, chewing on his cigar. The young Queen Elizabeth II has only been on the throne for 10 months, bringing a sense of a new Elizabethan age. The shops on Regent Street and Oxford Street are beginning to dress their windows with holly, tinsel, and electric lights, anticipating the joy of the coming Christmas. But under the bustle, beneath the hum of the red double-decker buses and the chatter of the markets, there is the cold. An early, vicious winter freeze has gripped the capital. It isn't a crisp, snowy cold. It is a biting, damp chill that settles deep into the marrow of your bones and refuses to leave. In 1952, central heating is a luxury reserved for the very wealthy or the very new. To fight the chill, London does what it has done for centuries, what it is built to do. It burns coal. In millions of hearths, from the crowded, drafty tenements of the East End to the high-ceilinged drawing rooms of Kensington, the coal scuttles are emptied. People are burning nutty slack, a cheap, low-grade, sulfur-rich coal that was often all they could afford in the post-war austerity. The fires are built high, crackling and spitting. The smoke rises, thick, greasy, black, and heavy. It drifts from factory chimneys, from the massive power stations like Battersea and Bankside that loom over the river, and from the exhaust pipes of chugging steam trains and diesel buses. Normally, the wind, the London Doctor, as the locals call it, would sweep this smoke down the Thames estuary, scattering it out to the North Sea, cleansing the city's lungs. But on this specific Thursday, The wind dies. The flags hang limp. The leaves stop rustling. Nature is setting a trap. A massive anticyclone, a high-pressure weather system, slides quietly over southern England and parks itself there, unmoving. It creates a meteorological phenomenon known as a temperature inversion. The ground is freezing, rapidly cooling the air immediately above it. But higher up in the atmosphere, a layer of warmer air moves in, sliding over the city like a heavy blanket. It acts like a tight lid on a boiling pot. The city is now a sealed room. The smoke, the exhaust, the industrial fumes, they have nowhere to go. They rise, hit the wall of warm air, and are pushed back down, compressed into the freezing streets. It begins to accumulate, and accumulate, and accumulate. The trap is sprung, and London is locked inside. As night falls on Thursday, the change is subtle at first, a thickening of the twilight that people brush off as just another winter evening. But as dawn breaks on Friday, December 5th, the city wakes up to a reality that defies explanation. The sun does not rise, or rather, it rises, but its light cannot pierce the dense, churning canopy that is formed overnight. Londoners step out their doors not into the grey mist they are used to, but into a wall of yellow-black sludge. This is the legendary pea super, but infinitely worse than anything in living memory. It isn't just water vapor, it is a chemical cocktail. The sulfur dioxide from the burning coal is reacting with the water droplets in the fog to form diluted sulfuric acid. The air itself has turned acidic. Take a breath. Imagine that sensation. The first inhalation burns the back of your throat like swallowing hot ash. Your eyes instantly begin to water and sting. The smell is overwhelming, a pungent metallic stench of rotten eggs, wet soot, and decaying leaves. It sticks to your clothes, it mats your hair, and it coats your skin in a greasy black film. By mid-morning on Friday, the visibility drops from yards to feet, and then from feet to inches. The familiar landmarks of London, Big Ben, St. Paul's Cathedral, Tower Bridge, simply vanish. They are erased from the skyline, swallowed whole by the smog. You could be standing directly beneath Nelson's column and not know it. The chaos is immediate and total. The pulse of the city begins to falter. Drivers can no longer see the road. Cars slow to a crawl, then stop entirely, abandoned in the middle of thoroughfares. The iconic red buses, the lifeline of the city, face an impossible struggle. In a desperate attempt to keep moving, conductors are forced to get off and walk in front of the buses, holding flaming torches or flashlights to guide the drivers inch by inch through the gloom. But eventually, even this becomes too dangerous. The entire fleet is recalled to the depots. The trains are next. Overland rail services are cancelled as signals become invisible. The underground still runs, but the stations begin to fill with the fog as it seeps down the escalators and through the tunnels, turning the platforms into hazy, choking chambers. But the most terrifying aspect isn't the traffic, it is the silence. London is a noisy city. It is a cacophony of engines, horns, shouts, and footsteps. But the fog acts as an acoustic damper. It swallows sound just as it swallows light. The roar of the city is muted to a dull, muffled thud. People walk softly, terrified of tripping over curbs or walking into walls. You can hear a cough from 3 feet away, but you can't see the person coughing. It creates a sense of profound isolation. You are surrounded by millions of people, yet you are completely, utterly alone in a bubble of yellow-gray. Crime begins to rise. Smash-and-grab raids on shop windows increase. because the thieves know they can vanish into the mist within seconds. Women clutch their handbags tighter. Men walk with their heads down. The fog provides the ultimate cover, stripping away the social order and replacing it with a primal, blind survival instinct. As Friday drags into Saturday, the fog doesn't lift, it thickens. It enters the theaters and cinemas. During a performance of La Traviata at Sadler's Wells, the audience can't see the stage. The actors are singing to a void. Films are projected onto screens that no one can see. The city's entertainment, its distractions, are shut down. And then the birds begin to die. Pigeons and sparrows, confused and blinded, crash into buildings and fall to the pavement. People walking their dogs notice the animals wheezing, their tails tucked between their legs, refusing to move. It is the first grim warning that this is not just an inconvenience, it is a massacre in slow motion. Inside the hospitals, the receptionists are noticing a disturbing trend. The waiting rooms are quiet, but the phone lines are beginning to light up. The elderly, the asthmatic, the young, they are struggling for breath. The London doctor has become the executioner, and the siege of the city has only just begun. The arteries of the city, its roads and railways, begin to sclerose. By Friday afternoon, the greatest transport network in the world has effectively ceased to exist. The iconic red double-decker buses, usually the relentless heartbeat of London, are reduced to hulking, motionless beasts. Drivers lean over their steering wheels, eyes straining against the windshield, but the beams of their headlights simply bounce back at them, a blinding wall of white glare against the yellow fog. It is like driving into a mirror. In a desperate, surreal attempt to keep the city moving, the bus conductors abandon their platforms. They step out into the freezing gloom, armed with flaming torches or weak flashlights, walking inches in front of the creeping buses. They shout instructions back to the drivers. Left, left, easy now, stop. Their voices muffled and ghostly. It is a procession of the damned, great mechanical leviathans crawling at a snail's pace behind stumbling men, guided only by flickering firelight. But soon, even this becomes too dangerous. The curbs disappear. The distinction between road and sidewalk vanishes. One by one, the buses pull over and switch off their engines. They are abandoned where they stand, left like gargantuan tombstones in the mist. Private cars follow suit, drivers simply opening their doors and walking away, leaving their vehicles in the middle of major thoroughfares because they no longer know where the edge of the road is. London is becoming a graveyard of silent machines. For the pedestrian, the city transforms into a terrifying labyrinth. Without visual cues, the mental map of London disintegrates. Commuters who have walked the same route from the tube station to their front door for decades find themselves hopelessly lost within 50 yards of their homes. They hug the walls of buildings, trailing their fingers along the cold, soot-stained brickwork, counting doorways, praying for a familiar texture or the shape of a familiar gate. There are stories, almost mythical now, of the blind leading the sighted. In this new world of total darkness, those who have lived without sight are suddenly the only ones who can navigate. They feel the shift in air pressure at a street corner. They hear the echo of a footstep change from pavement to cobblestone. Men in expensive suits, clutching briefcases, find themselves gripping the arms of blind strangers, begging to be led to the subway station. The sighted reduced to helplessness, the blind suddenly kings of the gray city. But the darkness is only half the horror. The other half is happening inside the lungs of every man, woman, and child in the city. This is not a passive event, it is a chemical assault. The air is now saturated with hydrochloric and sulfuric acid. With every breath, the cilia, the tiny hairs in the lungs, designed to filter out impurities, are overwhelmed and burned away. The body's natural defenses collapse. People walking home press handkerchiefs to their faces, trying to filter the air. Within 10 minutes, the white cotton is stained a deep, greasy black. When they blow their noses, the mucus is black. When they cough, and everyone is coughing now, a dry, rasping bark that echoes from every street corner, the spittle is flecked with black soot. The London cough changes its timbre. It is no longer just an irritation, it is a rattle. As evening falls, a new and chilling reality sets in. The emergency services are paralyzed. The ambulances cannot move. The police cars are grounded. The 999 calls are coming in, a deluge of desperate pleas from mothers with wheezing babies and children with gasping grandparents. But the operators have to deliver the unthinkable news: we cannot come to you. If you are sick, if you are dying, if you are choking on the very air in your bedroom, you are on your own. You have to walk to the hospital. And so, shadowy figures emerge from the gloom, carrying the sick in their arms, stumbling through the freezing blindness toward the faint, hazy glow of the hospital entrance lamps. The reception areas of St. Thomas and the Royal London Hospital begin to fill, but it isn't the chaotic bustle of a trauma ward. It is a quiet, wheezing suffocation. Patients sit in rows, their skin turning a pale, oxygen-starved blue, cyanosis setting in, while the nurses, their own eyes streaming and red-rimmed, rush from bed to bed with oxygen tanks that are rapidly running empty. Outside, the temperature drops further. The inversion layer hardens. The lid on the pot is screwed tighter. The fog, heavy with the exhaust of 1,000,000 coal fires and the breath of a dying city, settles in for the night. And London, the capital of the world, disappears completely. Monday night, December 8th, the city reaches its breaking point. The psychological toll is now competing with the physical one. This is the fourth night of total darkness. For nearly 100 hours, millions of people have lived in a state of sensory deprivation. The constant, oppressive gloom has warped the passage of time. Is it morning? Is it evening? In the sealed rooms of London, it is impossible to tell. Cabin fever sets in. Families are trapped in small, cold rooms, terrified to open a window for fear of letting the poison in, yet suffocating in the stale, smoky air of their own hearths. The soot has penetrated everywhere. It is in the bed sheets. It is in the butter left on the table. It is in the water glass by the bedside. You cannot wash it off because the water in the basin turns black the moment you dip your rag into it. The city is holding its breath, waiting to die. But then, in the early hours of Tuesday, December 9th, something shifts. It starts as a whisper. A loose slate rattles on a roof. A flag, limp for days, gives a tentative flap. The stagnant air, which has sat heavy and immovable like a physical weight, begins to stir. The London doctor has returned. A fresh wind from the west begins to push against the cold, heavy block of the anticyclone. Slowly, agonizingly, the lid is lifted from the pot. As dawn breaks on Tuesday, the transformation is miraculous. The impenetrable wall of black and brown begins to thin. It swirls, shreds, and dissipates. The visibility stretches from feet to yards, then to streets, then to miles. For the first time in 5 days, Londoners look up and see something that brings tears to their stinging eyes. the sky. A pale, watery sun breaks through. The relief is euphoric. People emerge from their homes like survivors of a bombing raid, blinking in the light, breathing in gulps of air that, while still dirty, no longer taste like acid. But as the fog recedes, it reveals a city that has been stained. London looks like a cadaver. Everything, the white stone of Buckingham Palace, the lions of Trafalgar Square, the windows of the department stores, is coated in a thick, greasy layer of black grime. The city is filthy. It is covered in a black snow of soot particles that have settled on every horizontal surface. And as the blindness lifts, the true horror becomes visible. The silence of the last 5 days is replaced by the sound of weeping. The Great Smog has left a body count that shocks the world. During the Blitz, the Luftwaffe dropped bombs that tore buildings apart. You could see the destruction. You could hear it. But the fog killed silently, leaving the buildings untouched, but stealing the breath from those inside them. The initial government reports are hesitant, estimating a few hundred deaths. But the undertakers know the truth. They are running out of coffins. The florists are running out of wreaths. In the week following the fog, the death toll climbs relentlessly. 4,000 deaths are attributed directly to the smog in the first few days alone. That is more civilians killed in 5 days of fog than in the worst months of the bombing raids. But modern research suggests the true number is far higher, closer to 12,000 souls. The hospitals are full of patients with acute respiratory infections, hypoxia, and heart failure. The very young and the very old have been decimated. There is a specific, haunting detail from the aftermath. The flowers. Because the smog was so toxic, it withered the flowers in the parks and gardens. But it also killed the flowers in the flower shops. When families went to buy funeral arrangements for their dead, they found that even the tributes had been poisoned. The city buried its dead with withered, blackened blooms. The Great London Fog of 1952 was not a natural disaster. It was a man-made catastrophe, amplified by weather. It was the moment the Industrial Revolution finally choked its creator. As the funeral processions wind their way through the soot-stained streets, a new mood takes hold of the survivors. It isn't relief anymore. It is anger, a cold, hard fury. They realize that the coal fires that kept them warm were the very weapon that killed their children. They look at the smoking chimneys of the power stations with new eyes. The romance of the London fog is dead. The era of the pea souper is over. The city demands a promise: never again. This tragedy would directly lead to the Clean Air Act of 1956, a landmark piece of legislation that would change the way the world thought about pollution. It was a lesson learned in the dark at a terrible price.
So the next time you take a deep breath of clear, cold morning air, remember the 5 days when London stopped breathing. Remember the silence. Remember the darkness. And remember the 12,000 ghosts who dissolved into the mist, their lives the cost of the air we breathe today. In this world of the blind became kings. For years, these men and women had navigated London not by sight, but by sound, texture, and the subtle shifts in air pressure. They lived in a map made of echoes. They knew that the reverberation of a footstep changes pitch when you move from pavement to cobblestone. They could feel the draft that signaled a subway entrance from 20 feet away. Suddenly, in this gray void, their perceived disability transformed into a superpower. The social order was inverted in the most surreal way. Wealthy businessmen in three-piece suits, clutching briefcases filled with important documents, found themselves reduced to helpless children. They stood paralyzed on street corners, gripping the arms of strangers with white canes, begging to be led to the underground station.
The sighted were lost in the glare. The blind were the only ones who could see the path. They became the pilots of the city, tapping their canes like sonar, leading conga lines of terrified commuters through the murk, navigating a world that had finally come down to their level. But while the streets were a landscape of confusion, the true horror was unfolding inside the lungs of the city's inhabitants. By Saturday afternoon, the fog is no longer just a navigational hazard, it is an active chemical aggressor. The composition of the air has shifted. The smoke from millions of coal fires, trapped by the thermal inversion, is reacting with the moisture in the stagnant air. The sulfur dioxide is oxidizing, turning into sulfuric acid. The people of London are not just breathing fog, they are breathing poison. It is a slow-motion gas attack. The first warning signs don't come from the people, but from the animals. At Earl's Court, the famous Smithfield Club cattle show is underway.
The finest livestock in the British Empire, massive, prize-winning bulls and sheep, have been brought to the city to be judged. But the ventilation system of the exhibition hall is pulling the smog inside and trapping it. The cattle, with their massive lungs, are the first to fall. The scene inside the hall descends into panic. Handlers watch in horror as their prize beasts, animals worth fortunes, begin to wheeze, their tongues lolling out, their eyes rolling back in terror as they fight for oxygen. In a desperate attempt to save them, farmers tear up burlap sacks, soak them in whiskey, and wrap them around the noses of the bulls, trying to create makeshift gas masks to filter the air. But it is a losing battle. By the end of the day, the show is canceled. Cows are dying where they stand, suffocated by the air of the capital. Their carcasses have to be disposed of immediately because their meat is now toxic. If a 2,000-pound bull cannot survive the air, what chance does a newborn baby have? What chance does an elderly war veteran with lungs scarred by mustard gas from the trenches? As Saturday evening sets in, the city's entertainment shuts down. The fog breaches the interiors of the great theaters. At Sadler's Wells, a performance of the opera La Traviata is abandoned in the first act. The audience cannot see the stage. The singers, choking on the acrid air, are singing into a void of swirling gray, their voices raspy and thin. Cinemas close their doors because the projectors can't cut through the haze in the auditorium. The beam of light dies before it hits the screen. The city is stripped of its distractions, leaving only the cold and the dark. Londoners retreat to their homes, seeking safety, but the fog is an insidious intruder. It seeps through the cracks in the sash windows. It slides under the heavy oak doors. It travels down the chimneys. Inside the homes, the air turns greasy. The sanctity of the domestic space is violated. You touch your armrest, and your fingers come away black. You pick up a cup of tea, and there is a film of iridescent oil on the surface. You blow your nose, and the tissue is stained with dark, gritty soot.
People try to improvise defenses. They drape wet sheets over their windows and doors, hoping the damp fabric will catch the soot. Within an hour, the sheets are jet black. They wear smog masks, flimsy pieces of gauze held on by elastic that offers zero protection against the sulfuric acid. These masks turn black within minutes, becoming clogged filters that you have to strap to your face. And then, the silence of the streets takes on a new, sinister quality. The ambulances have stopped running. The blue runners, as they are called, are grounded. The drivers can no longer see the road to reach the hospitals. The emergency services, the guardians of the city, are paralyzed. The 999 operators are sitting in their exchange rooms, overwhelmed with a deluge of calls. Mothers with gasping babies, children with collapsing grandparents. But the answer they have to give is always the same, delivered with a breaking voice. We cannot come to you. You are on your own. The London doctor has become the executioner. The sick must walk to the hospital. Shadowy figures emerge from the gloom, carrying the sick in their arms, stumbling through the freezing blindness toward the faint, hazy glow of the hospital entrance lamps. It is a pilgrimage of the dying. The reception areas of St. Thomas and the Royal London Hospital begin to fill, but it isn't the chaotic bustle of a trauma ward. It is a quiet, wheezing suffocation. The silence in the waiting rooms is terrifying. Patients sit in rows, their skin turning a pale, oxygen-starved blue, cyanosis setting in. They are drowning in plain sight, drowning in the air. The nurses, their own eyes streaming and red-rimmed, rush from bed to bed with oxygen tanks, but the supply is finite. The hiss of the oxygen masks is the only sound in the ward, and then, one by one, the tanks run empty. Saturday night bleeds into Sunday, and the death toll begins to climb in the dark, uncounted and unseen. In the morgues, the bodies are beginning to stack up, but outside, the city is still unaware of the scale of the tragedy. They are just waiting for the sun to rise, praying that the fog will leave. But the air hangs heavy, motionless, and deadly. There are remarkable true accounts from that weekend of the blind leading the sighted, a complete surreal inversion of the natural order. In a city where vision had become a liability, those who had lived in darkness their whole lives suddenly found themselves possessing a superpower. For years, these men and women had navigated London not by the deceptive evidence of their eyes, but by the honest geography of sound and touch. They lived in a map made of echoes and textures. They knew that the reverberation of a footstep changes pitch when you move from pavement to cobblestone. They could feel the subtle draft that signaled a subway entrance from 20 feet away. They could navigate by the smell of a bakery or the specific rattle of a loose fence paling. Suddenly, in this gray void, they were the pilots of the city. Suddenly, in this gray void, they were the pilots of the city. The social hierarchy was flipped on its head. Wealthy stockbrokers and powerful businessmen, usually the masters of the universe in their three-piece suits, found themselves reduced to helpless, terrified children. They stood paralyzed on street corners, gripping the arms of strangers with white canes, begging to be led to safety. A blind man in Notting Hill became a local legend that weekend. He was reported to have led a group of 12 stranded office workers all the way to the Notting Hill Gate underground station. Imagine the scene, a single man moving with the confident, rhythmic tap-tap-tap of his cane, walking briskly through the suffocating smog, while behind him a human chain of 12 sighted people shuffled in terror, clutching each other's coats, eyes streaming, completely dependent on a man they could not even see. The underground, the tube, was the only transport system that kept moving, but it was not a sanctuary. It was a trap of a different kind. The smog did not respect the boundaries of the surface. Driven by the high pressure, it was sucked down into the tunnels by the massive ventilation fans. It poured down the escalators like dry ice. The stations filled with a blue-gray haze that hovered over the tracks. The air down there was a noxious cocktail, the hot, stale, recycled air of the deep tunnels mixed with the freezing, sulfurous poison from above. It tasted of electricity, brake dust, and rotten eggs. The platforms became a subterranean purgatory. They were overcrowded, filled with thousands of people who were simply afraid to go back up to the surface. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces blackened with soot, coughing in unison. The tunnels themselves acted as storage tanks for the fumes. Drivers reported seeing the fog swirling in the beams of the train headlights as they roared through the darkness. It was a dystopian vision, a population driven underground, waiting for trains that were delayed by hours, coughing their lungs out in the flickering electric light. Above ground, life in the labyrinth required extraordinary adaptations for the most mundane tasks. Consider the milkman. In 1952, the daily delivery of milk was a lifeline. There were few refrigerators. Fresh milk was a daily necessity for tea and for babies. But how do you deliver bottles to doorsteps you can't see? How do you drive a float when the hood of your vehicle disappears into the gray? Many milkmen abandoned their modern electric floats, which were useless in the dark. Instead, they relied on a more ancient form of navigation. They brought out the horses. The dray horses, with their keen sense of smell and deep instinctual memory for the route, often knew the way better than the humans. The milkman would simply trust the horse, dropping the reins and letting the animal pull the cart through the opaque yellow wall. The horses would stop instinctively at the correct houses, their hooves clattering on the invisible pavement, navigating obstacles the drivers couldn't even perceive. It was a haunting sight, a horse emerging from the mist like a ghost, stopping at a gate, waiting for the milkman to stumble to the door, and then moving on to the next house without a command. It was a partnership of survival between man and beast. But not everyone in the labyrinth was a hero. The darkness brought out the predators. As the police patrols ceased, the bobbies unable to navigate their beats and the patrol cars grounded, a wave of lawlessness rippled through the city. The fog blinded the law. It was the perfect cover. Burglars realized they could smash a shop window, grab handfuls of jewelry, furs, or electronics, and vanish into the mist within seconds. A thief could snatch a purse and be invisible before the victim had even turned around to scream. There were reports of smash-and-grab raids on Oxford Street and Bond Street. Gangs broke into high-end stores, looting displays with impunity, knowing the police cars couldn't reach them. The fog provided a cloak of invisibility, stripping away the social contract. For a few days, parts of London felt like the Wild West, a lawless frontier where the only security was what you could carry in your hand. The sound of shattering glass became as common as the sound of coughing. Yet, for the vast majority of Londoners, the response was a quiet, stoic solidarity. It was the Blitz spirit reawakened. Just 7 years prior, these same people had huddled in bomb shelters while the Luftwaffe rained fire on their city. They knew how to endure. They knew how to cope with crisis. The muscle memory of survival kicked in. Strangers became teammates. If a car was inching along the curb, pedestrians would form impromptu navigation squads, shouting guidance. Left a bit. Watch the post. Curb coming up. Walking alongside the vehicles to keep them safe. If someone stumbled in the street, hands would reach out from the gray to steady them before they hit the ground. In the pubs that remained open, the mood was one of grim camaraderie. People gathered not just for a pint, but for the reassurance of human presence. They huddled together in the smoky warmth, the yellow fog swirling around the hanging lamps, sharing stories of their treacherous journeys. They coughed into their ales, trying to wash the metallic taste of the air from their mouths. The pub became a lighthouse in the gloom, a place to confirm that the world still existed. But the sanctuary of the indoors was failing. The fog was no longer just outside. It was coming in. It was an invasive species. It seeped through the cracks in the floorboards. It slid down the chimneys. It curled under the heavy oak doors. It stained the lace curtains black. Inside the cinemas, the projector beams died in the hazy air before they hit the screen. Inside the hospitals, the corridors filled with mist. Inside the bedrooms where children slept, the air turned a sickly green-yellow. There was nowhere left to hide. The city was not just surrounded, it was infiltrated. By Saturday night, the fog had infiltrated the cultural heart of the city, bringing the great machinery of London's nightlife to a grinding, unprecedented halt. At the legendary Sadler's Wells Theatre in Islington, a performance of Verdi's La Traviata was underway. It was a sold-out show, a moment of glamour amidst the gloom. But as the first act progressed, the fog began to seep into the auditorium. It rolled over the stalls, climbed the balconies, and settled on the stage. It wasn't just that the singers were struggling to breathe, their throats raw from the sulfur. It was that the audience physically could not see them. The soprano was singing her aria to a wall of swirling gray. The conductor could barely see the musicians in the pit. Finally, the performance was abandoned. The house lights came up, revealing a theater filled not with clear air, but with a thick blue haze, as the coughing audience shuffled out into the blind night. Across the West End, the great movie palaces, the Odeons and the Empires, were forcing their doors shut. Inside, the experience had become surreal. The powerful projector beams, usually shafts of pure light cutting through the darkness, were transformed into solid, tangible cones of illuminated dust. They hit the smog inside the auditorium and scattered, failing to reach the screen. Audiences sat in the dark, listening to the disembodied voices of Hollywood stars, staring at a swirling cloud of illuminated filth where the movie should have been. The illusion of cinema was broken by the reality of the air. Families retreated into their homes, slamming their front doors and turning the heavy iron keys, trying to lock the world out. But there was no keeping this enemy at bay. It was an invasive force. Housewives, desperate to keep their homes clean, took wet towels and stuffed them into the cracks under the doors. They taped over the gaps in the window frames. But the smog found a way. It defied physics. It seeped through the floorboards. It came down the chimneys. It stained the pristine white lace curtains a greasy, indelible black. It settled as a fine, oily film on the Sunday roast, making the meat taste of coal. It blackened the pages of the books people tried to read by the fireside. You would wash your hands, dry them, and 5 minutes later, your fingertips would be gray again. The dirt was inescapable. It was under fingernails, in hair, and deep in the pores of the skin. And it was cold, a biting, damp, bone-chilling cold that the fog only seemed to amplify. So the people did the only thing they knew how to do. They threw more coal on the fire. It was a tragic, fatal irony. The very action they took to keep warm, the very thing that made home feel safe and habitable, was the engine driving the disaster. In 1952, Britain was still recovering from the war. High-quality hard coal was being exported to pay off national debts. What remained for the domestic market was a low-grade fuel known as nutty slack. It was cheap, it was dusty, and it was incredibly dirty. It didn't burn clean, it smoldered. Every lump of nutty slack thrown onto a grate in a terraced house in Hackney, or a flat in Brixton, or a mansion in Kensington, sent plumes of thick, yellow, sulphurous smoke roaring up the chimney. Millions of chimneys acted as exhaust pipes, pumping the poison directly into the stagnant air that was trapped over the city. The people were literally feeding the beast that was suffocating them. They were trapped in a thermal loop. The more smoke they made, the less sun reached the ground. The less sun reached the ground, the colder it got. The colder it got, the more coal they burned. As Saturday turned to Sunday, the novelty of the pea souper was entirely gone. The romantic jokes about Sherlock Holmes had vanished. The city was tired. The city was dirty. And the city was beginning to feel sick. While the people navigated the physical labyrinth of the streets, a different, invisible, and far more deadly crisis was brewing inside their bodies. The hospitals were beginning to notice a disturbing shift. On Friday, the emergency rooms had treated broken legs and concussions from people falling in the darkness. But by Sunday morning, the waiting rooms were filling up with a different kind of casualty. Men and women were stumbling in, gasping for air, clutching their chests, their faces pale and clammy. The elderly, the asthmatic, the heavy smokers, the very young. The silence of the streets was about to be broken by the collective sound of a city fighting for breath. By Sunday, December 7th, the fog had stopped being a nuisance and started being a mass killer. While the city remained paralyzed in a gray, silent stillness on the outside, inside the delicate tissues of 8 million pairs of lungs, a chemical war was beginning. To understand why this specific fog was so deadly, we have to look at the chemistry of the air that weekend. This wasn't just water vapor and soot, it was a chemical weapon generated by a city against itself. As millions of tons of that sulfur-rich coal burned, it released massive amounts of sulfur dioxide gas into the stagnant air. Under normal conditions, this gas would disperse, but in the 100% humidity of the fog, something terrifying happened. The sulfur dioxide molecules dissolved into the microscopic water droplets that made up the fog. They reacted with oxygen to form sulfuric acid. The air of London had turned into an aerosol of acid. Every time a Londoner stepped outside to buy bread or even sat in their drafty living room inhaling the seepage, they were breathing in a mist of battery acid. It was weak, but it was relentless. With every breath, the acid attacked the bronchial tubes. It burned the lining of the throat. It paralyzed the cilia, the tiny hair-like structures in the lungs that are responsible for sweeping out mucus and dirt. With the body's natural cleaning system disabled, the soot particles, coated in acid, settled deep into the alveoli, the tiny air sacs where oxygen enters the blood. The lungs reacted by producing massive amounts of fluid to try and wash the acid away. But without the cilia to clear it, the fluid built up. People weren't just coughing, they were drowning. They were drowning in their own fluids, on dry land, in their own armchairs. The London cough changed its timbre. It became a wet, rasping, bubbling sound. And as Sunday dragged on, the oxygen levels in the blood of thousands of people began to drop to a critical low, and the silent massacre truly began. The sound of London changed. The muffled silence of the stalled traffic was replaced by a new, terrifying soundtrack that rose from the streets and the tenements, a cacophony of coughing. It wasn't the polite clearing of throats or the occasional winter sniffle. It was a dry, hacking, painful bark. It echoed through thin apartment walls, rattled down the chimneys, and reverberated through the hospital corridors. It was the sound of a city trying to expel the poison it had inhaled, a collective death rattle that signaled the beginning of the end for thousands. By Sunday afternoon, the hospitals were under siege. St. Bartholomew's, St. Thomas's, the Royal London Hospital, the great granite medical institutions of the capital were overwhelmed. The emergency room doors, usually swinging with the rhythm of ambulance arrivals, were now jammed with a different kind of traffic. But unlike a scene from the Blitz, where the injuries were bloody and visible, shrapnel wounds, burns, broken bones from collapsed masonry, These casualties were quiet, they were ghostly, and they were blue. Doctors reported a condition known as cyanosis, but they had never seen it on this scale before. Patients were stumbling in with their lips, earlobes, and fingertips turned a terrifying shade of violet blue, sometimes deepening to a dark slate gray. They were starving for oxygen. Their lungs were so irritated by the acid, so filled with fluid and black tar, that the alveoli simply couldn't process the air. They were drowning on dry land, asphyxiating in the middle of a room, their bodies screaming for air that simply wasn't there. The tragedy was that the medical community was fighting blind, both literally and metaphorically. Because the ambulances had stopped running, the drivers unable to navigate the impenetrable gloom, the supply chain of mercy was broken. The sick had to walk to the hospitals. Imagine that journey. You are fighting for breath. Your chest feels like it is clamped in a vice. Your heart is hammering against your ribs, and you have to walk a mile through freezing, blinding smog to find help. You have to navigate by feeling the frozen railings, knowing that if you collapse in the dark, no one will see you. Those who couldn't walk, the elderly trapped in upstairs bedrooms, the infirm, the very young, often never made it. They remained trapped in their homes, gasping for breath in the dark, clutching the arms of their chairs or the bars of their cribs, waiting for help that could not come. Inside the wards, the situation was descending into desperation. The hospitals were running out of everything, but the most critical shortage was air itself. Nurses scrambled to find oxygen tanks, dragging the heavy steel cylinders from ward to ward, the metal clanging against the floor, but supplies were running critically low. There are harrowing, heartbreaking accounts from that Sunday of hospital staff having to make impossible, godlike choices. There simply weren't enough oxygen tents, those plastic canopies placed over patients' beds to help them breathe, to go around. Doctors, exhausted and red-eyed, had to perform a brutal triage. Who gets the last cylinder of oxygen? Is it the 60-year-old war veteran with a history of bronchitis gasping for his life? Or is it the 4-year-old child in the next bed whose small chest is heaving with every desperate breath? Who do you save when you can't save everyone? And the fog had entered the wards, too. It did not respect the sterility of the hospital. Nurses recall seeing a blue haze hovering at the end of the corridors. The air inside the hospital was only marginally better than the air outside. The smell of sulfur mixed with the smell of disinfectant creates a scent memory that many retired nurses from that era still cannot forget. The smell of a hospital fighting a losing battle against the atmosphere. The invisible enemy struck the vulnerable with ruthless precision. Those with pre-existing respiratory conditions, asthma, bronchitis, emphysema, were the first to fall. Their airways constricted violently in reaction to the acid. Then came the elderly, whose hearts, already weak, couldn't take the strain of trying to pump blood through oxygen-starved lungs. Heart failure became the primary cause of death, triggered by the lung collapse. And then, the babies. The infant mortality rate spiked as tiny, developing lungs failed to cope with the toxic load. There were tragic scenes in pediatric wards where rows of cribs were filled with wheezing infants, their skin pale, the nurses weeping because there was nothing they could do but watch and hold their hands. Yet, incredibly, the scale of the disaster was not immediately obvious to the public or the government. There was no 24-hour news cycle. There was no internet. The newspapers were thin, and reporters couldn't get around the city to verify stories. The telephone lines were jammed with emergency calls. A doctor in Chelsea had no idea that a doctor in Whitechapel was facing the exact same crisis. Each hospital thought they were just having a particularly bad weekend, an isolated spike in admissions. The government, keen to avoid panic and focused on the economy, issued radio statements downplaying the fog, calling it severe weather rather than a catastrophe. The undertakers, however, were the first to understand the truth. By Monday morning, the sheer number of fatalities began to create a grim logistical problem. The death rate wasn't just ticking up, it was vertical. There were no more coffins. Undertakers ran out of wood. Carpenters were called in to work double shifts, but they couldn't keep up with the demand. Mortuaries filled up to capacity and then overflowed. Bodies had to be kept in temporary storage, sometimes in hospital chapels or waiting rooms, wrapped in sheets, labeled with tags, waiting for a fog that refused to lift. There were reports of florists running out of wreaths, and even the flowers that were available were withered and blackened by the sulfuric air, so the dead were buried with dying blooms. But for the average person on the street, the horror was still personal, not statistical. They didn't know that 4,000 people were dying that week. They didn't know that the total death toll would eventually reach 12,000. They only knew that their father wouldn't wake up. They only knew that the baby in the flat upstairs had stopped crying. They only knew that the city had become a tomb and they were trapped inside it. They didn't know that thousands were dying. They didn't know the statistics. They only knew that their father was breathing strangely, a rattle deep in his chest that sounded like crumpling paper. They knew that their baby wouldn't stop crying, a high-pitched, distressed wail that eventually faded into a terrifying, lethargic silence. They knew that their own chests felt heavy, as if a stone were sitting on their ribs, making every inhalation a conscious, muscular effort. They were fighting for every breath, and the cruel irony was that the air they were fighting for was the very thing poisoning them. It was a slow, quiet massacre. There were no explosions to mark the carnage. There were no air raid sirens wailing in the night to warn of an attack. There were no buildings crumbling into the street. There was just the hiss of a gas fire, the rattle of a loose window pane, and the desperate, wheezing struggle of a city suffocating in its own exhaust. The pea souper had transformed from a weather event into a tomb. And as Monday drew to a close, with the darkness pressing against the glass, the people of London began to wonder, with genuine fear, if the sun would ever shine on them again. Then came Tuesday, December 9th, 1952, the day the wind returned. For 5 agonizing days, the air had been a stagnant, motionless pool. But in the early hours of Tuesday morning, something shifted. A fresh breeze began to stir from the west. The heavy, oppressive lid of the temperature inversion began to crack. The London doctor, as the locals affectionately called the cleansing wind from the Atlantic, had finally arrived to make a house call. The lifting of the great fog was not sudden, like a curtain being pulled back. It was a slow, ragged retreat. The solid wall of yellow-black sludge began to churn and thin. The ceiling of the sky began to lift. And then, for the first time in nearly a week, a pale, watery sunlight touched the pavement. The relief was physical. It was euphoric. People stepped out of their doors, looking up, squinting at the brightness that hurt their eyes. They took deep breaths, testing the air. It was still cold, still damp, and it still tasted of smoke, but the crushing, suffocating weight of the sulfur was gone. The visibility stretched from yards to streets, then to miles. The Thames reappeared, a gray ribbon winding through the city, no longer an invisible void. The bus conductors climbed back into their cabs. The traffic lights became visible again, blinking red and green like reassuring heartbeats. But as the veil lifted, it revealed a city stained black. The fog had left its mark on everything. London looked like it had been dipped in ink. The buildings, the statues, the cars, the trees, everything was coated in a layer of greasy black soot. The black snow had settled on every horizontal surface. The pristine white stone of monuments like the cenotaph was streaked with grime. The lions of Trafalgar Square looked as though they were weeping black tears. Housewives scrubbed at their front steps, the water in their buckets turning instantly jet black. Shopkeepers washed their windows, revealing displays that had been hidden for days. The pigeons that flocked to the squares were darker, their feathers matted with the oily residue. The city had survived, but it was filthy. It felt contaminated. The damage was biological as well as structural. The cattle at the Smithfield Show, the famous agricultural event that had taken place during the smog, were not spared. Prize-winning cows, the finest in the nation, had choked to death in their stalls, their lungs filled with the same poison that had killed the citizens. Their carcasses were hauled away, a grotesque and heavy reminder that this had been no ordinary weather event. The meat had to be destroyed. The very flesh of the animals was considered toxic. But the grime on the buildings was nothing compared to the discovery being made in the mortuaries. As the city exhaled, the true cost of the week became horrifyingly clear. The silence of the fog was replaced by the somber, constant ringing of church bells. The undertakers were the first to know the truth. They were overwhelmed. There were no empty appointments. There were no empty coffins. The death toll was not in the hundreds, as the government had initially hoped. It was in the thousands. It created a logistical nightmare. Undertakers ran out of oak and elm. Carpenters were drafted in to work double shifts, hammering together simple boxes to hold the dead. There were waiting lists for funerals. The florists, too, faced a grim reality. The smog had withered the flowers in the shops and the greenhouses. People were forced to bury their loved ones with wreaths of holly or artificial flowers because the fresh blooms had died alongside the people. It took weeks to calculate the grim arithmetic. In the immediate aftermath, 4,000 extra deaths were recorded. But as the weeks went on, and those with lungs damaged by the acid succumbed to pneumonia and heart failure, the number climbed. Modern estimates suggest that the Great London Fog killed up to 12,000 people. That is more people killed in 5 days of fog than in the worst single incident of the Blitz. It was a tragedy that changed the world. The shock of the event, the realization that the very air of the city could kill, broke the romanticism of the London fog forever. It led directly to the Clean Air Act of 1956, a landmark piece of legislation that banned black smoke and forced the city to move away from coal. It was the moment humanity realized it could not treat the atmosphere as a sewer. So, the next time you walk through a city on a clear, crisp morning, take a deep breath, fill your lungs, and remember the week in December when London stopped breathing. Remember the silence, remember the darkness, and remember the 12,000 ghosts who dissolved into the mist, their lives the terrible price paid for the air we breathe today.
In the days following the clearing of the air, the undertakers of London faced a crisis unprecedented in the history of their trade, a logistical nightmare that belonged in a time of plague, not the 20th century. They had run out of coffins. They had run out of the oak and elm boards needed to build them. They had run out of the black crepe used to dress the windows of mourning. The florists had sold every white lily, every chrysanthemum, every carnation in the city. When the fresh flowers ran out, families were forced to buy artificial wreaths, or worse, lay blackened, soot-stained holly on the graves of their loved ones. The initial government estimates were cautious, almost dismissive, drafted by politicians terrified of causing panic or damaging the fragile post-war economy. They issued statements attributing the spike in mortality to a severe strain of influenza or simply the biting cold weather. It was a cover-up born of fear. But the undertakers knew the truth.
They were working around the clock, their workshops lit by bare bulbs deep into the night, the sound of hammers and saws never ceasing. The funeral processions were so frequent that they created traffic jams of their own. Long lines of black Daimler hearses wound through the streets, which were still coated in a layer of grime. At the cemeteries, the gravediggers could not keep up. They were digging by lamplight, excavating row after row of fresh earth to accommodate the sudden harvest of the fog. It wasn't just the sick and the elderly who were being buried. It was the sheer volume of sudden, inexplicable deaths that terrified the populace. A father who had walked home from work on Friday, complaining only of a tickle in his throat, was dead by Monday morning. A mother who had coughed a little while making tea on Saturday was gone by Tuesday. The speed of the collapse was terrifying. People were dying of heart failure caused by the sheer physical effort of trying to breathe. The numbers began to trickle out, and they were staggering. In a normal week, the death rate in London was statistically predictable. But during the week of the Great Smog and the week immediately following, that rate didn't just rise, it skyrocketed vertically. The final count of the immediate dead, those who died during the 5 days of darkness and the week following, was 4,000 people. Let that number sink in. 4,000 people. That is more than the civilian casualties of the very worst air raids of the Blitz. But there were no Heinkel bombers screaming from the sky, no air raid sirens wailing, no craters in the roads, no shattered buildings, no fires raging in the docks. Just people quietly stopping in their beds, their lungs defeated by the air they breathed, their lives snuffed out in the privacy of their own homes. It was a massacre without a weapon. And the dying didn't stop when the fog lifted. The damage done to the lungs of the survivors was severe and often permanent. The sulfuric acid had scarred the delicate tissues of the bronchial tubes, leaving thousands susceptible to infection. In the months of January and February that followed, another 8,000 people would die from respiratory complications, pneumonia, heart failure, acute bronchitis, directly linked to those 5 terrifying days in December. The total death toll is now estimated to be around 12,000 people, an entire town's worth of people erased by the air. A shockwave went through the city. This wasn't a natural disaster like a flood or a hurricane. It wasn't an act of God. It was a man-made catastrophe. It was a self-inflicted wound. For centuries, Londoners had accepted the fog as the price of living in the greatest industrial city on earth. It was the cost of progress. It was the cost of industry. It was the cost of staying warm. The London particular was almost a point of pride, a quirk of the city. But as the funerals multiplied, as the hearses passed every day on the street, that acceptance turned into a cold, hard anger. People looked at the smoke still belching from the massive brick chimneys of the inner-city power stations, Battersea, Bankside, Kingston, and they didn't see the symbols of power and imperial progress anymore. They saw poison. They saw the source of the murder. They looked at their own coal fires, the heart of the British home, the hearth around which the family gathered, and realized with a shudder that they were part of the problem. They were burning the fuel that was killing their neighbors. The romance of the fog was dead, buried alongside the 12,000 victims. This anger forced a reckoning. The Great Smog of 1952 became the catalyst for a revolution. It made the invisible visible. It led directly to the Clean Air Act of 1956, a landmark piece of legislation that was pushed through by public outrage. It banned the burning of dirty coal in the city. It introduced smoke control areas. It forced the power stations to move out of the city center. It offered grants to homeowners to convert their coal fires to gas, electricity, or smokeless fuel. It was the moment the world woke up to the concept of air pollution.
It proved that the air we breathe is not an infinite resource, but a fragile one that can be broken.
In the years that followed, the physical city began to change. The buildings, which had been black with soot for centuries, were cleaned. The layer of grime was scrubbed away to reveal the white stone beneath. London literally lightened. The pea soupers became a thing of the past, relegated to history books and movies. So, the next time you look at a photograph of old London shrouded in mist, don't just see the romance of Sherlock Holmes or the atmosphere of a Dickens novel. Don't just see the aesthetic of the gaslight era. See the reality. See the darkness. See the trap. And remember the 12,000 souls who paid the ultimate price for the right to breathe clean air. This was the week the city suffocated, and in doing so, finally learned how to breathe. The Great Smog of 1952 had shattered the illusion that the atmosphere was an infinite dumping ground. It proved with brutal efficiency that the air had a breaking point. The fog had cleared, but had left behind a city that was forever changed. The survivors were washing the soot from their windows and scrubbing the grime from their front steps, but they could not wash away the memory of the blindness, the suffocation, and the silence. The city was physically clean, but psychologically stained. The time for romanticizing the London particular, that cozy literary image of fog swirling around gas lamps and hansom cabs, was over. The time for action was approaching. But first, the city had to mourn, and then it had to remember. The weeks and months following the Great Smog were defined by a strange collective haunting. The fog had physically lifted, dissipating into the North Sea, but psychologically, it still blanketed the city. Londoners developed a new nervous reflex. Post-traumatic stress had settled over the capital. Every time the sky turned a certain shade of heavy gray, every time a morning mist clung a little too tightly to the surface of the Thames or hovered over the Serpentine in Hyde Park, a ripple of genuine panic would move through the streets. Mothers would rush to bring their children inside, slamming doors and checking window latches as if preparing for a siege. The elderly would check their supplies of candles and canned food, their hands trembling, terrified of being trapped again in the dark. The trauma of those 5 days had rewired the instinct of the city. They now knew that the air, the very thing that sustained them, the thing they trusted implicitly, could turn against them at any moment. But as the grief settled, it began to curdle into something sharper, something colder, and something much more dangerous for the politicians in Westminster: rage. For generations, the British government had prioritized industry over health. Coal was the engine of the empire. It powered the factories, the trains, and the ships that connected the world. It was the lifeblood of the nation. But in 1952, the context was different. In the desperate post-war economic slump, Britain was broke. To pay off massive war debts, the government was aggressively exporting its high-quality, clean-burning hard coal to Europe and America. It was a vital source of revenue. What did they leave for their own people? They left the nutty slack. They kept the dirtiest, dustiest, sulfur-rich coal for the domestic market. They had effectively legislated the pollution into existence. The government had made a calculated trade-off. They sold the clean air to pay the bills, and they left the poison for the British people to burn in their own hearths. Every time a Londoner coughed, they were choking on the consequences of national economic policy. The irony was bitter. The British people had survived the German bombs only to be poisoned by their own government's coal. In the immediate aftermath, the government tried to downplay the catastrophe. It was a cover-up born of fear and bureaucracy. Ministers stood up in the House of Commons, straightened their ties, and dismissed the death toll. They waved away the numbers with arrogant ease. They blamed a coincidental influenza epidemic, though there was no virus found. They blamed the unusually cold weather, saying old people simply died in winter. They called it a natural phenomenon, a freak weather event, an act of God that no government could control or prevent. Harold Macmillan, the Minister of Housing and a future Prime Minister, was particularly resistant. He initially blocked calls for a public inquiry. His logic was cold and political. He feared an inquiry would force the government to build new homes with electricity or gas, which would be too expensive and slow down the post-war rebuilding effort. He dismissed the fog as a nuisance, not a killer. He famously quipped that we cannot legislate for the weather. But the public wasn't buying it. The evidence was too stark, and the bodies were piled too high. The undertakers knew it wasn't the flu. They had seen the bodies. Flu victims don't turn blue from lack of oxygen. Flu victims don't have lungs filled with black sludge. The doctors, who had seen patients drowning in their own fluids without a spike in fever, knew it wasn't the flu. They knew it was chemical poisoning. The florists, who had sold out of every funeral wreath in the city, knew it wasn't the flu. A disconnect grew between the official line coming from Whitehall and the lived reality of the streets. The people looked at the smoking chimneys of the Battersea Power Station, which was burning thousands of tons of coal a day right in the heart of the city, and they didn't see progress. They saw a weapon. They looked at the soot that still stained the stone of the cenotaph and felt a deep sense of betrayal. The pressure began to mount. Newspapers, usually compliant, began to run headlines demanding answers. Why did they die? Screamed the front pages. One MP, Gerald Nabarro, began a relentless campaign in Parliament, waving bundles of dirty letters and soot-stained handkerchiefs at the ministers, demanding accountability. He refused to let the 12,000 dead be forgotten. The sheer weight of the tragedy began to crack the stone walls of government denial. The Beaver Committee was eventually formed to investigate, and their findings were damning. They confirmed what everyone already knew. The fog was a loaded gun, but the coal smoke pulled the trigger. This realization forced a cultural shift. For centuries, the open coal fire was the center of the British home. It was the symbol of comfort, family, and safety. But the Great Smog turned that symbol into a pariah. People began to look at their fireplaces with suspicion. The hearth and home became the enemy within. The 12,000 ghosts of December were demanding a reckoning, and the government could no longer hide in the fog. The tragedy would lead directly to the Clean Air Act of 1956, the first legislation in the world to acknowledge that the government had a duty to protect the air we breathe. It was a victory won in the dark at a terrible price, but it ensured that while London might still get foggy, it would never again choke to death. The press began to circle, sensing blood in the water. Newspapers that had once treated the fog as a quirky, almost affectionate British eccentricity, a backdrop for romance, mystery, and the adventures of Sherlock Holmes, now sharpened their nibs. They ran headlines screaming the killer smog and death in the air. They published the mortality graphs, jagged black lines that shot upward like a vertical cliff face during that first week of December, visually tracking the slaughter. They told the gut-wrenching stories of the cattle dead at Smithfield and the old men found dead in their armchairs, their fires burnt out. The pressure became insurmountable. The government, initially sluggish, defensive, and fearful of the economic repercussions, was forced to act. They commissioned a committee, led by the industrialist Sir Hugh Beaver, to investigate the disaster. They hoped for a whitewash, a report that would blame the freak weather and exonerate the industry. But the Beaver Committee's report, released in 1954, was a bombshell. It refused to play politics. It stripped away the excuses and the acts of God rhetoric. It laid the blame squarely, undeniably, on the domestic burning of coal. It calculated the cost of the smog, not just in lives, though it confirmed the horrific death toll, but in money. It tallied the lost work hours, the strain on the NHS, the cost of cleaning the soot from buildings, the corrosion of metal and stone, and the waste of fuel. It spoke a language the government understood. Pollution was expensive. It was bad for business. It argued that clean air was not a luxury, but a national necessity. This was the turning point. It was the moment London decided to stop choking itself. In 1956, 4 years after the darkness, Parliament passed the Clean Air Act. It was a revolutionary, landmark piece of legislation, the first of its kind in the world to explicitly address air pollution as a public health crisis. It didn't just tweak the rules, it fundamentally changed the British way of life. It marked the end of an era that had begun with the Industrial Revolution. The Act established strict smoke control areas across the city. In these zones, the burning of raw, bituminous black coal was declared illegal. It was a ban on the very smell of London. Residents were forced to convert their beloved open fireplaces, the beating heart of the British home, to burn smokeless fuels like coke, which was harder to light and burned with a dull glow, or to switch to electricity and gas. It went further. Factory chimneys were required to be raised higher to disperse fumes into the upper atmosphere. New filtering technologies were mandated. The massive power stations, the cathedrals of power like Battersea and Bankside, were eventually forced to stop burning coal or move out of the city center entirely. It was a massive, intrusive, and expensive undertaking. It involved the government reaching into the living rooms of private citizens. Inspectors, dubbed smoke police, were sent into private homes to check fireplaces and ensure compliance. They would walk the streets watching the chimney pots. If they saw dark smoke rising from a house in a controlled zone, they would knock on the door and issue a fine. They offered grants to help families buy new grates and heaters, but the transition was jarring. There was resistance, deep cultural resistance. People loved their coal fires. The open hearth was more than a heat source, it was the focal point of the family. It was where you dried your clothes, toasted your bread, and gathered for safety. It was a symbol of British resilience. They loved the crackle, the smell, the dancing yellow flames. They didn't want to burn the odorless, sterile-looking, smokeless fuel that sat in the grate like dead gray rocks and provided little radiant heat. They felt their civil liberties were being infringed upon. An Englishman's home is his castle, they argued in pubs and letters to the editor, and he should be allowed to burn what he wants. But the memory of 1952 was too fresh. The opposition could not stand against the ghosts. The memory of the blindness, the taste of acid on the tongue, the sound of the coughing that came through the walls, and the coffins piled in chapel waiting rooms silenced the dissent. The people realized that the cozy fire was a killer. The narrative had shifted. The smoke wasn't a comfort, it was a shroud. Slowly, agonizingly, the air began to change. It didn't happen overnight. The transition took decades. There was another bad smog in 1962, but it killed far fewer people, proving the act was working. Gradually, the pea supers vanished. The yellow gloom was replaced by grey mist, and then, finally, by clear air. The city began to clean itself. In the 1960s and 70s, a massive program of sandblasting began. Workmen scaled the great buildings of London, St. Paul's Cathedral, the National Gallery, the Treasury, the Houses of Parliament, which had been jet black for a century. They blasted away the layers of crusted soot that had accumulated since the time of Dickens, and underneath they revealed the honey-coloured limestone that no one living had ever seen. London literally lightened. It emerged from its chrysalis of dirt, a brighter, cleaner city, a visible testament to the success of the law. The Clean Air Act of 1956 became a blueprint for the world. It inspired similar legislation in the United States and across Europe. It proved that environmental disaster is not inevitable. It is a choice, and the solution, while difficult and culturally painful, is possible. The Great London Fog was a tragedy of biblical proportions, a plague of darkness brought on by human hands. But out of that darkness came a new enlightenment. The 12,000 souls who died in the smog did not die in vain. Their deaths purchased the clean air that billions of people breathe today. They forced the world to look up, see the smoke, and finally decide to clear the sky. It wasn't an overnight miracle. Legislation is ink on paper. It takes time to change the habits of a civilization built on coal. There were other fogs, other scares. In 1962, 10 years later, another dense smog descended on the capital. The panic returned instantly. The old fear gripped the throat of the city. But this time, the death toll was significantly lower. The law was working. The yellow wall never returned with the same apocalyptic intensity. The sulfur levels dropped year on year. The legendary pea souper slowly faded from a daily reality into a folk tale, a story grandfathers told to wide-eyed children who would never taste the acid air for themselves. And then, as the air cleared, the city began to reveal itself.
For nearly a century, London had been a black city. This wasn't a metaphor, it was a physical reality. The soot had coated everything. St. Paul's Cathedral, the National Gallery, the Bank of England, the great stone arches of government, they were all covered in a thick, grim layer of industrial grime. It was a crust of carbon that had accumulated since the days of Dickens. It was so pervasive, so total, that generations of Londoners had grown up believing that London stone was naturally black. They thought the darkness was the natural state of the architecture. With the air finally clean, a massive, decades-long restoration project began. It was one of the greatest acts of urban renewal in history. Crews scaled the buildings with high-pressure water jets, sand blasters, and scrub brushes. They looked like mountaineers scaling soot-stained cliffs. As they washed away decades of coal deposits, a startling, almost blinding transformation occurred. Underneath the black crust, the stone wasn't gray, it wasn't brown. It was a brilliant, creamy white. It was Portland stone, glowing in the sun.
As the scaffolding came down, piece by piece, street by street, Londoners saw their city as it was meant to be seen. It was like watching a restoration of an old master painting, but on the scale of a metropolis. The gloom was physically scrubbed away. The bright white dome of St. Paul's Cathedral rising above the skyline became a beacon. It shone. It became a symbol of this new clarity, a visual metaphor for a city that had looked into the abyss, seen the terrible consequences of its actions, and chosen to change. The city literally lightened, shedding its Victorian mourning weeds to embrace the modern age. But the legacy of the Great Smog extends far beyond clean stone and smokeless zones. Its true monument is invisible. It was the birth of modern environmentalism. Before 1952, the sky was seen as a sewer, a limitless void where you could dump waste and it would magically disappear. Smoke was viewed as a sign of economic health. A smoking chimney meant jobs. The Great Smog destroyed that fallacy. It proved with lethal evidence that the sky has a limit. It taught the world that the atmosphere is a closed system. It taught us that what we put into the air stays there, and eventually it enters us. The 12,000 deaths in London forced a paradigm shift. It moved the conversation from nuisance to survival. It paved the way for the environmental movements of the 1960s and 70s. It set the precedent for tackling acid rain, for the hole in the ozone layer, and eventually for the fight against climate change. Today, we take clean air laws for granted. We look at a chimney belching black smoke, and we instinctively know it is wrong. But that instinct was forged in the cold, dark silence of December 1952. So the next time you take a breath, a deep, easy breath of air that doesn't burn, doesn't taste of sulfur, and doesn't kill you, remember the London fog. Remember the price that was paid for it. The clear sky above you is not a guarantee. It is a victory, won by the ghosts of a city that once disappeared. The Clean Air Act of 1956 became more than just a statute in a law book. It became a blueprint for the modern world. It rippled outward across the Atlantic and the Channel, inspiring similar legislation in the United States and across Europe. It changed the global consciousness. Every time we check an air quality app on our phones today to see the AQI, every time a city restricts traffic to create a low-emission zone, every time a factory is fined for pumping chemicals into the sky, we are seeing the direct echoes of that terrifying week in December. We are living in the legacy of those who fought for the right to breathe. We learned a profound lesson in the dark. Resilience isn't just about enduring the darkness while it's happening, it's about doing the hard, expensive, and necessary work to ensure the darkness never returns. It is about the courage to change the way we live to protect the life we have. The survivors of 1952 are fewer now. Their voices are growing quieter, fading like the mist over the Thames. But their story remains a stark, eternal warning. It reminds us of how fragile our complex civilization truly is, how quickly the systems we rely on, transport, health, commerce, can collapse when nature tips the scales, and how the most basic necessity of existence, the simple breath in our lungs, can never, ever be taken for granted. London survived the trap it set for itself. It scrubbed the soot from its face and emerged brighter, cleaner, and wiser. But the question echoes down the decades. As we face new invisible threats in our modern atmosphere, have we truly learned the lesson? But that is a question for the daylight. That is a question for tomorrow. For now, our journey into the shadows of the past is complete. We can leave the year 1952 behind. We can step out of the fog and back into the safety and comfort of the present moment. Let the tension of the story drain out of you. Let the history fade into the archives of the night. You have traveled through time and witnessed the resilience of the human spirit, and now you have returned home. The lantern we lit to explore the past is dimming now, its flame flickering out, leaving you in a soft, comforting darkness. A darkness not of smog, but of rest. The city sleeps. The history books are closed. The air is clear. Thank you for traveling with us into the mist. But now it is time to rest. Let the silence wrap around you like a warm blanket. Let your breathing slow down. Let the world fade away. Good night.